Is it water with the sheep in the box?
There is no conspiracy theory as popular and as absolutely fucking unhinged as that of Missing 411. If you've become attuned to the conspiracy YouTube space like I have after my previous videos about ghosts and cryptids, you will have been more than aware of YouTube videos with titles like these and thumbnails like these. Great stuff. But alright, not everyone is clued in on weird conspiracy bullshit, so for those of you sadly unaware of it, what is Missing 411? Well, in the simplest possible terms, it's the theory that there is an unusually high level of disappearances in America's national parks and forests for some unexplained reason, and further, that the National Park Service is actively covering them up in order to protect their secrets and hide the real reason for these disappearances. This reason is usually left intentionally vague and or mysterious because, well, that's how conspiracy theories work, but for reasons we'll later go on to discuss, it's Bigfoot. It's never explicitly stated, at least by the people who want to be taken seriously, but it's definitely Bigfoot. More on that later. In this video, we'll be discussing 411, its originator David Paulides, the theories often posited for it, and of course the history of disappearances and supernatural beliefs concerning places like this. So, let's begin with the origin of the Missing 411 theory is quite simply that, well, sometimes people go missing 411. Specifically, as I just mentioned, it refers to the conspiracy theory concerning mysterious and unsolved disappearances in American national parks, often, though not always, hinting at or outright claiming that there is some kind of supernatural root cause or explanation, and crucially that the US government, specifically in this case the National Park Service and or the FBI, are participating in an active cover-up operation in order to either protect the secrets of what is truly going on in America's national parks, or else to prevent mass panic should anyone put two and two together. Ignore the fact that the main proponents of this conspiracy, just like the main proponents of UFO conspiracies, which we will get around to talking about someday, have not been taken out by the government, a government that is all too willing to enact brutal overthrows of third world governments if they so much as look too long at a copy of the Communist Manifesto, and attempted to assassinate Fidel Castro 634 times, by the way. But more on that in a moment. First of all, let's talk about these disappearances, shall we? And importantly, what counts as a Missing 411 case as opposed to a normal, explainable disappearance or death by either exposure, accident, or something like animal attack? Well, David Paulides, who, again, we will discuss later, is the man who started this whole conspiracy, and in brief, here is how he defines a Missing 411 case as opposed to a more expected or normal case of misadventure or accidental death or disappearance. There are several versions of this, however. In brief, Missing 411 cases, according to Paulides, share some common characteristics, such as the victims are often young children or adults who are experienced outdoors. They disappear in areas that are well travelled and relatively safe. There is often no evidence of a struggle or foul play. The victims are found miles from their last known location, often in areas that are difficult to access. Or at least that's the basics and how this all started. In addition to these, more recently, Paulides has, based on research into hundreds of these cases that fall within the above parameters, come up with a more specific list of 10 common factors that he believes are associated with these cases, which are as follows. 1. The victim is found in an area that is outside of their normal range of travel. 2. The victim is found in an area that is difficult to access, such as a ravine or steep cliff. 3. The victim is found in an area that is not consistent with their known abilities, such as a child being found in a remote area that is difficult for even an adult to navigate. The victim's clothing is found neatly folded or stacked rather than being torn off or removed in a hurry. The victim's shoes are found neatly placed together. Victim's belongings are found scattered or missing, often over huge distances. The victim's body is found in an advanced state of decomposition, even though they have only been missing for a short period of time. The victim's body is found in an area that has been searched multiple times. The victim's body is found with no signs of injury or trauma. The victim's body is found in an area that is known for paranormal activity. Yes, some of these are contradictory, and no, nobody seems to care. Paulides believes, somewhat erroneously in my opinion, that these factors point to the possibility that there is a supernatural force or phenomenon that is responsible for these disappearances. He claims to have explored a number of possible explanations, including animal attacks, hypothermia, and human foul play, but he's not found any that can fully explain the pattern of disappearances, and so ruled them out. I call bullshit on this, sorry. This is the guy who's made a documentary called Missing 411: The UFO Connection, and regularly appears at conspiracy conventions to speak for money. I'm sure it's a complete coincidence that he's a Bigfoot enthusiast and has written multiple books about Bigfoot and how he definitely exists. He just couldn't rule it out as easily as natural causes or the elements. Importantly, Paulides rules out certain cases from his database to exclude the cases that could be explained by other things. For some examples of this, people who are reported as having mental illness or suicidal thoughts, people who may have drowned in a river or washed away in a lake because they can be ambiguous, and cases where it could likely have been an animal attack. Or at least so he says. I would argue that most legit missing 411 cases could fall into the above exceptions, but that's a matter of opinion, I suppose. Further to these, and separately, Paulides has identified a further list of commonalities between cases in his book Missing 411 North America and Beyond, though it is often argued that the list I just provided is more accurate and a more up-to-date version. I did feel it was important to bring up this list for the sake of transparency and completionism, and to point out how arbitrary these rules seem to be. Victim has a disability. Victim was playing with his or her dog at the time of disappearance and left with the dog. Inclement weather hits the area at the time the victim disappears. Search dogs cannot find the victim's scent. Victim is found uphill from where they went missing. Victim is found in a creek bed. Victim is found without shoes. Victim is found dazed or confused. I can't remember what happened or doesn't want to talk about it. Searchers cannot find the victim. Victim is part of a growing cluster of missing people, and clusters appear to have common themes. Certain types of people who go missing. Are you starting to get the impression that the fact that this theory has so many different definitions and exceptions that it's confusing and borderline impossible for an outsider to wrap their head around, whilst making it significantly easier to define just about any case as missing 411, and likely very easy to discount any inconvenient case as never having been part of a conspiracy theory? Because I am. What adds to the conspiracy and mystery side of this theory is that not only are there so many of these cases that Paulides and others have identified, but also Freedom of Information Act requests Paulides and fellow internet sleuths have made that are either denied, issued, but heavily redacted, or cost unrealistic amounts of money to access. Almost as if the government is hiding something. Well, before we go into some case studies, let's be logical about this. The commonalities between the cases do seem to indicate a particular vulnerability, and also that the disappearances can be quite easily explained away as natural deaths, accidents, foul play, animal attacks, and so on. It is tempting for us as humans to consider ourselves immune to the effects of nature, but we're not. Even the most experienced and competent survivalist can find themselves succumbing to nature, which is infamously as violent and brutal as it is beautiful. We have in many ways conquered aspects of nature with our hospitals, modern medicine and iPhones, but that does not mean that nature is harmless to us, in the same way as we can cage an animal, but that animal is no less dangerous should we decide to get in the cage with it. That aside, let's go through some examples of missing 411 cases, shall we? On April 29th, 1981, 84-year-old Reverend Maurice Doc Demetz went on a trip with a friend, David McSherry, rock hunting, which for those unaware is, well, looking for fancy rocks. A weird hobby, I guess, but look at what I do in my spare time. I make videos like this, so I can hardly talk. In an area known as Devil's Head, Colorado, in the Pike National Forest. The mysterious part about this is that McSherry claims to have been more than 50 yards away from Demetz at any point, so how could he have disappeared without being seen? McSherry claims to have left Demetz alone for 15 minutes at maximum to go pack up the car to go home, and in that time Demetz simply vanished. No trace of him has ever been found since either. There are no signs of a struggle where Demetz was last seen, no blood, no extra set of footprints, nothing, which seems to rule out animal attack or foul play. Demetz had no enemies to speak of either, which would seem to further rule out murder. The authorities carried out a thorough search of the area, but no trace of Demetz was ever found alive, or, being honest here, more likely dead. As with all missing 411 cases, there is massive, widespread speculation on this issue. Perhaps, some claim, he decided to go find a tree to piss up against and got lost or fell down some hidden ravine, or even decided to commit suicide and die on his own terms, surrounded by the beauty of the park, or, as an offshoot to this theory, maybe he's still alive and living as a wild man, not wanting to be found. However, the problem with these theories is that, given his poor health, it was later determined that he could not have possibly made it far far, certainly not far enough to have been misled by the search of the surrounding areas. One rather depressing alternate theory is that in fact McSherry and Demetz never went to the area to begin with, there was no rock hunting expedition in the first place, and in fact the story was made up by McSherry to cover up his murder of his friend, or in some versions an assisted suicide. However, this also seems unlikely as Demetz does not seem to have been suicidal at all, and there was no motive uncovered for McSherry to kill Demetz. Fun fact though, Demetz was something of a religious conspiracy theorist. I was quoted in a rather unhinged pamphlet called "The Antichrist is Now Here" thusly. Another writer, Morris G. Demetz, in Christian Victory magazine, June 1971, says of the coming Antichrist, "He will be the political, religious, commercial autocrat of the world, the long-looked-for Superman who will satisfy the political, commercial, industrial, social and religious world," which of course has led to some online to suggest that maybe he was killed by the devil or something, because of course, why not? It's about as believable as Bigfoot, which is the prevailing missing 411 theory, but more on that later. This one's just really sad. In brief, Dennis Martin was a 6-year-old boy who disappeared while camping on a family hiking trip in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1969. Martin disappeared on June 14th at 4:30 while planning on surprising a family friend who had also attended. He was last seen by his father going behind a bush to hide, intending to jump out and surprise the adults with the other children. After not seeing him for about 5 minutes and when all the other children had returned, Dennis's father became concerned and began searching for him, but Dennis had disappeared. He ran down the trail for nearly 2 miles until he was sure a small child could not have gotten any further. After several hours, the family sought help from the National Park Service rangers. Now, to be clear here, the area where Martin disappeared is known for steep slopes and ravines and is infested with wild animals such as copperhead snakes, bears, feral hogs and bobcats. To add to this, a torrential downpour began shortly after Martin's disappearance, dropping 3 inches of rain in a matter of hours, which washed out trails and caused streams to flood. As if that were not bad enough, temperatures on the night of the disappearance dropped to nearly 10 degrees Celsius, aka your average British summer, making survival extremely unlikely and search efforts much more difficult. This case is often cited as an example of a disastrous search effort. Mist and rain made the search difficult, and due to the publicity of the case, up to 1,400 people were included in the search effort, which some argue is a factor potentially obscuring possible clues, though personally I don't really get that. I'm no expert, but surely more searches would just be a good way to increase the chances of finding someone. On the other hand, I acknowledge that it confused things by mixing up footprints of searchers, as footprints were found in the area but were dismissed from the possibility of being Martin's by park officials who determined them to have been left instead by a Boy Scout participating in the search. Who knows how accurate this assessment is? After all, the NPS is in on the conspiracy to hide these disappearances apparently. A separate set of child-sized footprints led to a stream where they disappeared. Tracks indicated that one foot was barefoot while the other was in a tennis shoe, indicating that Martin had somehow lost the shoe and subsequently fell into and got swept away by the water, which as we mentioned earlier was likely rougher than usual due to the rainfall. By June 22nd, 56 square miles of ground had been covered. The search was abandoned on June 29th and after a number of further excursions, the search was officially closed down on September 14th, 1969. As of right now, it is still the largest search in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So what happened to Martin? Well, according to many theories I've seen online covering this, including but not limited to Wikipedia, and Wikipedia wouldn't lie, there are 3 main theories and they are as follows. 1. He wandered off, got lost and died from the exposure or some other cause, likely during the first night. As I suggested, being washed away by an unusually strong current is a possibility. This is the most probable theory according to park officials, which of course means that it's probably a lie they made up to hide the truth about Bigfoot. 2. He was attacked and either killed or carried off by one of the many terrifying wild animals known to frequent the area, possibly a bear. 3. He was abducted and taken either further into or out of the park by something or someone. Martin's father was a proponent of this theory, though there is no proof of it, of course. There is speculation and circumstantial evidence, like the account of a tourist also in the same area of the park, who claimed to hear an enormous sickening scream followed by seeing an unkempt, rough-looking man running up the trail to near where the scream had come from. The man then apparently got into a white car car and abruptly sped off in it. Park rangers and the FBI concluded that there was insufficient evidence to link this account to Martin's disappearance, particularly given that it occurred approximately 5 miles away from where Martin disappeared, the exact time of the sighting being unknown, and the lack of trails connecting to the two sites. But again, that man was probably Bigfoot, rather than just some random homeless guy, making this just another example of the government covering up the abduction and or murder of a small child, but by Bigfoot, not a police officer this time. Wake up, sheeple. This one is rather infamous because the evidence of it was posted online. Basically, in late 2014, 47-year-old Las Vegas man Kenny Veach, known online by his YouTube handle Snakebit McGee, disappeared while hiking in the Mojave Desert in Nevada. Prior to his disappearance, Veach had made himself known online after posting a comment on a YouTube video titled "Son of an Area 51 Technician," in which he claimed to have found a strange cave shaped like a capital M while hiking near the Nellis Air Force Base that caused his body to vibrate and gave him a feeling of dread. Pretty standard UFO shit. It was probably them boomers. After posting his comment on the video, which is no longer visible, Veach was encouraged by the various responses he got to attempt to locate the cave again and record it on video. A pics or it didn't happen situation, I suppose. But to be fair, he was claiming to have found a magic cave, so extraordinary claims and all that. Veach actually did do this, which at the very least makes it impressive that he chose to commit to winning an argument on the internet by going out into the real world and touching grass, making him a rarity. During this filmed search, he was unable to rediscover the cave, prompting people online to call him a liar. So, months later, he ventured out in search of the cave a third time, and this time never returned. His phone was found abandoned near the entrance to an old mine shaft, but Veach's body was never recovered. Now, in my opinion, it certainly seems like he could have just got lost in a cave system while exploring, making him just one more in a long line of people who got themselves killed while trying to win an argument on the internet. But I don't know, maybe he did find the cave and the aliens took him to their mothership to probe him or something. I guess it's technically not impossible.
Hello, monkey!
For fuck's sake, I knew this would happen eventually. Ever since I refused to talk about Bigfoot in the cryptids video for a gag, I should have known I would eventually be forced to circle back around and talk about this big fucking hairy motherfucker. Alright, let's get this over with. Bigfoot, otherwise known as Sasquatch if you're being spicy, is most of the time described as being a large ape-like humanoid creature covered in fur and standing between 6 to 15 feet tall, which is a frankly insane amount of variance. It can either be about human size or about 3 times that, and that's normal, I guess. As is the case with many cryptids, Bigfoot primarily exists in areas where other animals may be mistaken for it, in this case bears, meaning that the creature allegedly lives in remote forested areas, particularly in North America, though much like the Loch Ness Monster, a few places around the world claim to have their own knockoff versions like the Yeti or skunk ape, for example, but generally Bigfoot exists in the Pacific Northwest of America, except he doesn't because he isn't real. But people say he does, which is close enough. As mentioned, the origin of Bigfoot likely has its roots in indigenous legends of hairy giants living in the wilderness that existed long before white settlers arrived, though as Trey the Explainer pointed out in his genuinely fantastic video on the subject, much of this Native American Bigfoot stuff is actually just retroactive appropriation and misunderstanding, deliberate or otherwise, of various indigenous folk tales and legends in order to build the Bigfoot mythos and lending an air of credibility to the legend. See, he's not just made up by Europeans, there's stories going back thousands of years about him. Likewise, in a lot of European folklore, there are tales of wild men, hairy human-like creatures living in the wilderness, usually filling the role of antagonist to the supposed civilized nations from which these stories originate, and since the history of Europe is primarily just being invaded by your neighbours, usually this would just be a way of saying, the people over there are all uncivilized, let's invade them and teach them how to make real pottery, for example.
2000 BC, 4,000 years ago, is the Beaker folk, wasn't it? Bloody Beaker folk. The Beaker folk coming over here, rowing up the Tagus estuary from the Iberian Peninsula and improvised rap. Bloody Beaker folk coming over here with their beakers, with their drinking vessels. What's wrong with just cupping up the water in your hands? and licking it up like a cat.
And these likely influenced early Bigfoot stories once European colonization of the Americas began and these mythologies began crossing over and mixing in the minds of many. There are a few interpretations of who or what Bigfoot is, varying from the more simple "it's a big monkey" to more supernatural claims. For example, in many interpretations, Bigfoot is seen as a protector of the wild, challenging our encroachment on natural spaces, a kind of nature spirit, similar to those of ancient Celtic mythology such as the Green Man, which, unlike what Armoured Skeptic may have you believe, is not the centre of some kind of insane alien conspiracy.
I do not believe that this is an alien, but this guy isn't entirely Homo sapien either. I'm forced to conclude that he is, at very least, a human hybrid.
But merely a mythological figure of ancient British history. Some of the more realistic, to be extremely generous, theories posit that Bigfoot is not an ape or a monster, but in fact an undiscovered primate species, potentially of human or near-human intelligence, hiding from society to avoid being wiped out like the many other human-like species we drove to extinction in our distant past. To many, Bigfoot symbolises the natural human urge to explore and become close to nature, the allure of the unknown, representing what eludes our understanding and control, and our drive to escape the mundanity of our world, to leave the oppressive open plan offices and bland corporate bullshit behind and go live in the woods. As someone who's recently gone through a lot of issues with my IRL job and work life, I can relate. So, does Bigfoot exist? Well, no. But let's talk about some of the reasons why people may still believe that he does. There's a lot of so-called evidence that supposedly corroborates the existence of Bigfoot, though none that has been scientifically verified, obviously, because Bigfoot isn't real. As mentioned in a previous video, there was that one TV show that put its money where its mouth was and offered $10 million for conclusive proof of Bigfoot, but all that happened is that a bunch of nutters embarrassed themselves on TV and did insane shit like licking slugs and carrying around some plastic plates covered in ape menstrual fluid to try and make Bigfoot horny. Probably the highlight of that was when one guy claimed to have killed two Bigfoots, didn't provide evidence, but claimed that a scientist confirmed that it was feral human, meaning that he either killed someone or was lying. Anyway, this so-called evidence usually boils down to stuff like blurry photos, grainy videos, and easily faked giant footprints. The modern craze really kicked off in the 50s, with newspaper reports and eyewitness accounts of large footprints causing nationwide fascination, really kicked into high gear with the infamous Patterson-Gimlin film, released in 1967, which allegedly captured a walking Bigfoot, basically immediately making Bigfoot a pop culture icon, and even to this day is iconic, being parodied and referenced all over the place. Hell, I even used it in the thumbnail of my cryptids video because, along with the surgeon's photo of Nessie, it's probably the most well-known piece of cryptid imagery. Let's dig into some of this stuff. First, footprints. Large 3 to 5 toed tracks are probably the most common evidence, and of course is how Bigfoot got his name, his big feet. However, footprints are easy to fake. Indeed, in the cryptids video we covered how Loch Ness Monster footprints were faked using an umbrella stand. Some of the original claims have proven to be hoaxes, along with many others, though some have just been misidentified bear tracks because obviously Bigfoot is just a bear half the time. Some remain unidentified, but until it can be conclusively proven that they belong to an as yet unidentified bipedal creature, I'm skeptical. Also, if Bigfoot is a missing human ancestor, presumably he would always have 5 toes like most other human ancestors we're aware of, so where are the 3-toed footprints coming from? Eyewitness accounts and the next one are essentially worthless. As mentioned in my last cryptids video, as well as the ghost hunters one, the human brain is easily fooled, especially when under high stress, like for example being alone in the wilderness in the dark, and can easily mistake things like bears and shadows for something that isn't really there. Some are likely just completely made up, and obviously many cannot be proven or corroborated. Anyone can say they saw Bigfoot, but it doesn't make it true, any more than David Icke saying that the moon is actually a secret space station designed to telepathically prevent us from seeing the lizard people all around us makes it true. Photo and video evidence, again, is just about as unreliable as you can get. Mostly is grainy grainy footage, blurry images, easily manipulated or used to hide obvious visual trickery, and much like ghost sightings, it's funny that only after the invention of Photoshop and other digital image manipulation techniques became available that we started seeing more clear so-called evidence. Even prominent examples like the Patterson Gimlin film, which is so grainy and inconclusive that it's very likely just a guy in a gorilla suit, and there would be no way to prove it either way, has been widely disputed as a hoax, and the same is true for almost all of this type of evidence. Hair samples, ever the favourite of the cryptid hunter, are as usual inconclusive. Much like the hair samples supposedly from the chupacabra, the results are always the same. Some findings match known animals, while others remain unidentified or inconclusive, leaving room for interpretation. And unidentified samples don't mean a new species, obviously, it just means there's no real result because DNA is complicated. If DNA found at the scene of a crime is tested and comes back inconclusive, that doesn't mean that a cryptid committed the crime, does it? And then finally there's audio recordings which are worthless. Usually it's just people in tents recording sounds they hear about them in the wilderness. Grunts, howls and other vocalizations that are attributed to Bigfoot in particular are common, though I'm not sure what they intend to do with this evidence. Without Bigfoot to compare the noises against, all they did was record some weird spooky noises, which, like, yeah, that's part of nature. Obviously, having checked this evidence, it turns out that similar sounds can be produced by known animals or environmental factors, and of course hoaxes are not out of the question either. There are two main schools of thought regarding Bigfoot. Either he's not real because of the lack of physical evidence, obviously, despite decades of searching, no body, bone or tangible proof of Bigfoot's existence has been found, which is weird if there's a breeding population of large ape men living in some pretty well-traversed areas. The fact that almost all Bigfoot evidence can be attributed to known animals, including but not limited to bears, or maybe bears with mange, much like the chupacabra is likely just dogs with mange. The proven existence of hoaxes and either deliberate or ignorant misidentification, and the simple fact that until conclusive evidence is provided, we must assume that Bigfoot isn't real. That's how skepticism and science works, after all. However, despite all this, some enthusiasts continue to argue that the absence of proof doesn't necessarily disprove anything, especially for a potentially elusive creature, ignoring that as the ones making such outlandish claims, the burden of proof is on the believers, and that a lot of the unidentified evidence warrants further investigation. Alright, so some of these hair samples are from bears and wolves and shit, but the ones that are inconclusive, what about them? Look, my bias is clear, and I made a whole 2-hour-long video about cryptids and how they don't really exist, but are very interesting, not too long ago. I do not believe that Bigfoot is real, and I don't think that there is any conclusive evidence whatsoever sufficient to change my mind at the moment. However, if any arises and seems believable, I'm open to considering it and potentially changing my mind. Ultimately though, it's impossible to deny the cultural importance and impact of Bigfoot as a story and as a symbol. Regardless, this was the briefest breakdown of Bigfoot legend and its validity that I could provide. I know it may feel like a weird aside or distraction from this video, but as mentioned a few times already, and I will not stop going on about this, it is incredibly important to have at least a baseline understanding of this for a lot of the video to make sense, so here you are. Originally this part was going to be at the end of the video, but annoyingly I discovered that the more I researched this conspiracy, the more it became clear that Bigfoot is such a big and important part of the missing 411 phenomenon that I kind of had to move it closer to the beginning. Anyway, that's done now. Let's talk about missing people and get back on track.
Hello, monkey!
Missing 411 cases are not the only examples of missing or vanished people, obviously. People going missing or dying in mysterious circumstances is nothing new and definitely not unique to US national parks. There are infamous examples of seemingly unexplainable phenomena, both in urban areas and in different countries around the world. Take the Dyatlov Pass incident or the case of the Eastdal woman as examples, or even if we want to stick with American examples, though Paulides doesn't, the case of Elisa Lam was one of these before rationality eventually won out. Or even if we want to just restrict ourselves to disappearances, which again Paulides doesn't, a lot of missing 411 cases do involve people who turn back up, usually dead. Madeleine McCann disappeared from a heavily populated tourist resort, and JF Garepi's wife disappeared in Canada in definitely not at all suspicious circumstances, so it's not an isolated or region-specific thing. But having said that, it must be acknowledged that conspiracies around missing people have always been a part of American culture, from Amelia Earhart to the lost colony of Roanoke. Some might use this to argue that this is proof that Bigfoot has been abducting people since the beginning, but I'm not so sure about that one. Truth is, these occurrences happen all over the world and in different circumstances, but for some reason don't get fixated on as much in these circumstances. As it turns out, America does indeed have the largest number of missing people. However, as most sources for this statistic acknowledge, comparative per-culture data on missing people is difficult and by no means exact or reliable. For example, most countries have varying degrees of differing definitions on what counts as a missing person, like for example how long they've been missing or whether a disappearance is considered a case of foul play, or even when a missing person is found, which 80% of people are within 24 to 48 hours by the way, are they then removed from the missing person statistics, which can then make data difficult to compare. Also, as it turns out, accessing the data in the first place before we even come to comparisons can be challenging due to not only the complexity and variation of what each country considers a disappearance, but also because, unsurprisingly, a lot of countries will just flat out refuse to provide that information, or if they do, much of it may have been redacted or manipulated in some way. Another factor, of course, is the effectiveness of local and national law enforcement. Obviously, some countries will have better and more effective systems in place for the reporting and investigation of missing persons than others, meaning that in some places, the number of missing persons may be underreported because the systems are less robust or more difficult to use. And obviously that's not taking into account that some police forces may be complicit in corrupt activities involving the disappearances of certain groups of people, like for example political opponents in more authoritarian places, or even just the well-documented phenomenon of indigenous women being victims of murder and disappearances in the US, much of which goes uninvestigated by the police. And by now we've all seen that some police forces are complicit in the over-policing of black neighbourhoods when it comes to finding them guilty of crimes white people get away with more often. But also where black people are the victims of crime, those cases often go underreported. It turns out, in a place where the state has unchecked power and is able to carry out violence against groups of people it dislikes, or at the very least turn a blind eye to violence happening within those communities, disappearances go up among those groups. Weird how that happens, eh? Population, obviously, must also be taken into account. Like, sure, the US has one of the highest numbers of disappearances, but so do India and China, because in raw numbers, the higher the general population of a country, the more disappearances are going to be reported. To compensate for this, missing persons data is often expressed in terms of the number of missing persons per 100,000 people. However, as previously mentioned, much of this data is misreported or simply not recorded, so much of the time it's not accurate. All this to say, when online people say the US has such a high number of disappearances compared to much of the rest of the world, remember that this is accurate and useful information only up to a point. Yes, the US has a high rate of disappearances than, say, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Small aside here, but I wrote this part of the script before it came to light that the Democratic Republic of Congo is actually undergoing a horrific campaign of violence due to Rwandan-backed rebel groups, and as a result there are actually a lot of disappearances there, so this was a very bad example I picked out of thin air at random. Donate to charities helping the victims of these atrocities and pretend I said Luxembourg or something, but there is a lot of context missing there that conspiracy theorists often overlook. People blame Bigfoot for US disappearances, but rarely seem to blame Mokele and Mbembe for disappearances in Central Africa. I wonder why. Oh, and one final thing before we move on. The rate of disappearances in urban areas far outstrips that of rural areas or national parks, so unless there's an urban Bigfoot, that particular theory seems unlikely. But not gonna lie, Urban Bigfoot is a movie I would love to watch, especially after imbibing certain substances, shall we say. Let's talk about the National Park Service then. In short, the National Park Service, or NPS, is a part of the US government that looks after all national parks, as well as national monuments and other similar stuff that falls within their purview. It's been around since 1916 and technically appears among other so-called three-letter agencies along the FBI, CIA, FDA, ATF, and so on, in that they technically wield the power and authority to enforce the will of the state over the people when it comes to their specific niche, often heavily biased in favour of corporate interests, because that's how neoliberalism works, baby! For an example of this going way too far, see Waco. But what is a national park? Well, in brief, according to most sources, a national park is an area of natural space legally set aside by a national government for the preservation of the natural environment and or beauty for the purposes of public recreation and enjoyment, or occasionally for its historic or scientific interest. In the UK, for example, the Lake District, Snowdonia and the Cairngorms are all considered national parks due to either their natural beauty, endangered wildlife, or historical significance. In the US, the main ones are the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Appalachian Mountains, but there are in total 52.4 million acres worth of national park divided between the 63 parks across the US, and overlooking them, of course, is the National Park Service. The NPS is surprisingly large, employing, according to some articles I found online linked below, approximately 20,000 people in 425 individual units covering over 85 million acres in all 50 states, the District of Columbia and US territories. As of 2019, they also had more than 279,000 volunteers at their disposal as well. In brief, according to its agency mission, the agency is charged with preserving the ecological and historical integrity of the places entrusted into its management, including but not limited to national parks, whilst also making them available and accessible for public use and enjoyment. A pretty harmless and even wholesome role in the otherwise pretty authoritarian state system, one would think. A lot of countries around the world have similar agencies, of course. The UK has a number of national park authorities, which are united under National Parks UK. Australia has the Parks and Wildlife Service, which is a part of the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions. Norway has the Directorate for Nature Management, South Africa has sandparks, and China has the National Forestry and Grassland Administration, for a few more. This concept is not a new or unique or sinister one, at least on its face. It's like having a fire brigade, uncontroversially good and positive, ubiquitous across the world, and one of the few seemingly totally positive parts of government operation, but, well, the National Park Service conspiracy, or at least the main one, because the thing about conspiracies is that there are so many of them about pretty much everything, is a theory that the NPS is covering up mysterious disappearances and other unexplained events that occur in national parks. The proposed causes of these disappearances are often up to interpretation, but as mentioned several times now, it's often supernatural or just Bigfoot, or sometimes aliens. Proponents of the theory point to the higher number of missing persons in national parks, as well as the strange circumstances surrounding some of these disappearances as evidence of a cover-up. It's connected but not synonymous with Missing 411, as Missing 411 is merely the mysterious disappearances. The NPS conspiracy is a bolted-on conspiracy which suggests that the NPS is aware of the Missing 411 phenomenon and is actively and deliberately covering it up and hiding it from the public for reasons. The NPS conspiracy theory is to Missing 411 what Area 51 and the Men in Black, the conspiracy, not the movie, are to UFO conspiracies. Much like Missing 411, however, the NPS conspiracy is also almost entirely based on, or at least was popularised by, David Paulides' Missing 411 books and documentaries, which we'll talk about a bit later. But for a brief summary, Paulides is a former police officer who has written several books on the subject of missing persons in national parks, and also Bigfoot, but I'm sure that's a total coincidence, and claims that over 1,400 people have disappeared in national parks under mysterious circumstances since 1980. Crucially, he also suggests, or at least implies, that the NPS is actively obstructing investigations into these disappearances. Proponents of the NPS conspiracy offer a variety of flimsy explanations for why the NPS might be covering up strange events in national parks. Some believe that the NPS is trying to protect the image of the national park system and prevent people from being afraid to visit, as a lot of states' economies rely upon the money brought in by tourism due to people visiting a national park in their jurisdiction. Others believe that the NPS is covering up evidence of alien activity or other paranormal phenomena, primarily fucking Bigfoot, because of course, the MPS has denied all allegations of a cover-up, but of course they would, they're in the pocket of Big Sasquatch. The agency says that it takes all missing persons cases very seriously and that it works closely with other law enforcement agencies to investigate these cases. The MPS also says that it's committed to transparency and that it publishes information about missing persons cases on its website, which is true. In fact, many of these conspiracy people even use the MPS itself as a source to prove some kind of conspiracy. Despite the MPS's denials, the MPS conspiracy theory remains popular amongst certain types of online weirdo. There's a number of websites and online forums and, of course, YouTube videos dedicated to the theory, and several books and documentaries on the subject have been produced, not just by Paulides. Probably my favourite is this guy because his thumbnails are just incredible, or possibly the Law Lodge, whose main claim to fame is being Wendigoon's less charismatic and more problematic friend. I really don't have time to go on a whole tangent about his backstory, but he's a very cringe giggle libertarian with some pretty wild takes, let's leave it at that, and who once, in the middle of some online drama with a fellow conspiracy theorist, posted an indignant essay on YouTube community notes which includes the following incredible lines. "You also claim that I always use clickbait titles to rationally explain away conspiracies, for example the National Parks one, which I can very easily see you did not watch, because I conclude that the NPS is hiding the Wendigo. I know the history of Freemasonry way better than you. I know numerous 32nd degree Masons personally, and will be interviewing a 33rd this summer. Another lie. You say you don't think I'm a real Mason. Here I am in Pennsylvania Freemason back in autumn. I hope your followers understand the implications of you not being able to find that out. It's also not as simple as just signing up to a lodge, and the fact that you didn't know that is honestly not surprising at this point. I've actually been on a board of inquiry, thank you very much." Incredible stuff. I love these insane people. This should be a copy pasta, in my opinion, along the same lines as the Navy SEAL one. "What the fuck did you just fucking say about me, you little bitch? I'll have you know that I know the history of Freemasonry way more than you, and I know numerous 32nd degree Masons personally," etc. The Law Lodge has over 300k subs, and what lurks beneath, the thumbnail guy, has almost 700k. It's important to note that, like just about every conspiracy theory, there is little to no credible evidence to support the MPS conspiracy theory. The vast majority of missing persons cases in national parks are eventually solved, and there is no evidence that the MPS is actively or deliberately obstructing investigations into these cases. Even channels like the Law Lodge, which admittedly do incredibly well researched and fully sourced work, though seem to be somewhat lacking in the tact department.
If you'd like to try ZBiotics, you can go to zbiotics.com/lorelodge or use promo code LORELodge to get 15% off your first order today. Unfortunately, nothing that ZBiotics brings to the table could protect Tommy from what was going to happen to him that night.
Are at best able to offer conjecture and come to conclusions not really based on the evidence presented, because ultimately all that good work and quality research is kind of wasted when you come into the project with a predetermined illogical belief in the supernatural and therefore heavy bias towards certain specific conclusions, in my opinion. No hate to these people, I actually do watch some of their videos, though since starting writing the script for this video, the Law Lodge have pivoted away from Missing 411 and towards an equally stupid conspiracy theory, the so-called smiley face killers, which I don't have time to talk about here, but suffice to say that it's equally nonsensical, and Wendigoon especially, who's made Missing 411 videos before, is a great content creator despite being a cringe libertarian and the kind of guy who openly praises extremely cringe out-of-pocket diss tracks inspired by terminally online internet drama made by his friends.
See them making fun of you on Kiwi farms. They're talking about how much of a freak you are, and I'd honestly feel bad, and I'd offer you my pity, but I'm busy out here buying me a sleek new car.
It's the Mauler problem again. Much like Mauler, Wendigoon isn't explicitly right-wing, bigoted, racist, etc., but he certainly seems to hang around pretty exclusively with people who are significantly more open about their right-wing political and social views, associate uncritically with them, and collaborate with them, in much the same way as Mauler does with all his EFAP mates like Shadiversity and Heel vs Babyface.
Homosexuality in the animal kingdom, and I found this just so bafflingly bizarre that they would use this and frame it in such a way to try and say homosexuality, everyone does, it's just a normal thing in the animal kingdom. Animals do it, so therefore it's normal for humans to do it. And I was like, what, hang on, are you really using that framing?
So you don't get to believe in gay animals and evolution at the same time.
Regardless, even if Wendigoon is also friends with more reasonable and less controversial people, it leaves the rather concerning matter of him being okay with supporting and publicly being associated with some of these characters. This doesn't make Wendigoon a bad or toxic person or anything, but like, you know, it's a bit sus. More hanging out with the fucking pronouns guy doesn't make him a transphobe, but it does make one wonder why anyone would be friends with the fucking pronouns guy unless they either agreed or were willing to overlook his open bigotry. Oh, and also he apparently started, or at least was instrumental in the early organisation and popularisation of the far-right Boogaloo Boys movement that claims to have got out before they got violent and racist, and also tries to justify it with what is ultimately a pretty obvious lie in my opinion. Yeah, sure bro, you helped start a meme anti-government movement based around Che Guevara, a man who you as a conservative admit to hating, and a word he supposedly used during the Cuban Revolution decades before it was coined. For those wondering, the word boogaloo first came around in 1966 to describe a genre of Latin American music, and the Cuban Revolution was in 1953, rather than the pretty obvious reason the modern Boogaloo Boys themselves give. It's a reference to the Second Civil War, a race war that they both believe is inevitable and also want to bring about. Civil War II Electric Boogaloo, colloquially known as the Boog because these fucking people are obsessed with cringe memes, and his Twitter likes are often slightly concerning, but enough about this fucking guy. I'm mostly just pissed off that he ruined Hawaiian shirts for people who aren't just totally unhinged maniacs. Now I have to actually explain that no, I don't want to incite race-based violence, I'm just queer and autistic. But regardless, in my opinion, these YouTubers are not practicing skepticism to a degree I would consider preferable when talking about conspiracy theories based on little to no measurable objective evidence. However, despite all this, the MPS conspiracy continues to fascinate people, enough to allow content creators to make entire lucrative careers around talking about it, perhaps because it taps into our fear of the unknown and our desire to believe that there is more to the world than meets the eye, and perhaps because as a social species who seem to prefer to build civilizations over living as a lone wolf or hermit in the woods, a sigma male if you will, the rarest type of male, the idea of isolation far away from anyone who can help in the wild unknown is a primal fear.
Hello, monkey!
This is not new. As we spoke about in previous videos, humans have a tendency to seek explanations for things that seem to defy understanding, and over time, this can lead to otherwise pretty normal or explainable situations being misconstrued as mysterious or supernatural. The idea being, if a lot of unfortunate or weird things start happening in a certain area, often a mythology may arise around that area, implying that there is something about the land itself that is evil in some way. The causes of this vary depending on local customs and belief systems, but generally the main supposed causes are that an evil creature or spirit resides in the area or potentially placed a curse on it, or else the simple fact that such tragedy has occurred in said area that has caused it to become cursed even when it wasn't before. You can see modern versions of this even today, of course. Indeed, much of Missing 411 is based on the assumption that we are encroaching on Bigfoot's territory, but for a more historical example, and this will be the subject of its own video someday, take the legend of Black Annis, a little known witch figure originating in the town I grew up in, who was said to live in a cave on a hill, and should any children venture near the cave, they may suffer a terrible fate. Or even look at the stories of fairy circles, or the legend of the fairy king who lived in Glastonbury Tor, which we spoke about in the King Arthur video a while ago. For an example of the other kind of cursed land, simply look at modern pop culture conceptions of things like the Indian burial ground, the so-called Japanese suicide forest, or stories about how not even birds fly over Auschwitz. The idea is simple. If enough bad stuff happens somewhere, it must somehow seep into the ground, making it an evil or else somehow cursed place. Of course, logically, this makes no sense. Just because something bad happened in a place, that place is just a place like any other, right? A place that holds the weight of history perhaps, but that's a purely psychological phenomenon, not a supernatural one. You or I might walk around Auschwitz and have a profound empathetic or emotional experience standing in a place where so many people suffered and died, but that is by no means a universal experience. A neo-Nazi, for example, might disagree with our take on what it represents and have absolutely no emotional reaction, or maybe even an opposite one. I mean, people have weddings on old slave plantations for fuck's sake, but the theories and rumours persist. Some places, it is argued, are cursed or in some way supernatural, and the disappearances that take place in these places serve as further proof of this. Perhaps the theory can then be extended to imply this is what's happening with Missing 411. Maybe they are simply cursed or or supernaturally active areas in these national parks that people just kind of just stumble into and fall prey either to the curse or the supernatural entity residing there. So let's take a look at a couple of historical examples of disappearances in places believed to be at the very least supernatural. Let's talk about the horrific legacy of colonialism in this fun video about a conspiracy theory, shall we? I am of course talking about the lost colony of Roanoke, one of the earliest colonies established in what came to be known as the New World, but is what we now refer to as the Americas, and is the centre of one of history's most enduring mysteries, surrounding a mass disappearance in an area many consider to be mysterious. In brief, the story goes like this. In 1587, the colony of Roanoke was founded on the island now known as Hatteras Island, a small strip of land off the coast of North Carolina. Probably the reason it still holds any significance at all is that this settlement, had the inhabitants not disappeared, would have been the first permanent English colony in the New World. Kind of like how the Titanic is famous primarily because its maiden voyage was supposed to be a groundbreaking step in cross-Atlantic travel and technological marvel. Many ships have crashed and sunk dramatically both before and after the Titanic, but have received much less attention even when the death counts were significantly higher. Upon settling the island, it quickly became clear that the colonists' supplies would not be sufficient to sustain them for long term, at least without knowledge of the land they did not possess, so it fell to the leader, John White, to return to England to request resources and manpower from the government in order to help properly establish the colony. Sadly, due to delays and of course the fact that this was fucking 1587 and crossing the Atlantic just took a long time regardless, he was only able to return 3 years later. When he did, of course, and this is the part we've been building up to, he found the settlement deserted. His wife, child and grandchild, the first English child born in the Americas, Virginia Dare, which is why a lot of places in the US are echoes of that name, along with every single one of the other colonists, had vanished without a trace. However, it appears that either the colonists before they left or someone else left a message. The word Croatoan and the letters CRO carved into trees within the colony's borders were the only signs pointing to an explanation. Now, obviously, the implication here is that they just went to the neighbouring island that happened to be called Croatoan, but sadly, White and his crew were unable to search Croatoan for the missing colonists as a violent storm prevented them from doing so, forcing them to turn back for England and abandon Roanoke and its inhabitants for good. So that's the story. Now for some speculation. Where might the inhabitants of Roanoke have gone? Well, obviously, let's start with Croatoan, as it was then known. At the time, the island was inhabited by a group of Native Americans known as the Hatteras Indians, so naturally, the assumption must therefore be that the colonists, struggling to survive with the supplies they had and unfamiliar with the local environment and what could be safely eaten or used in other ways, simply either begged for or were offered to join this group, assimilating into their community. Of course, another theory is that they went to war with the Hatteras people over some dispute or other, presumably over land, and were all killed and their bodies disposed of in some way. This would leave those Croatoan clues having a more sinister meaning, being lesser "this is where we went" and more "this is who killed us." Either of these options are possible, and there is about as much evidence, or at least real evidence, not including shit like the Dare Stones, for either, but my personal opinion is more likely the former, for the simple reason that for the most part these colonists were mostly peaceful and friendly towards the natives, and the locals were not considered an unusually aggressive people towards the colonists, though there was some tension between them over food, so it seems like a bunch of kind of dumb idiots bumbling around trying not to die and mostly failing would be unlikely to really clash violently with a mostly peaceful nearby people unless there's extra context we're missing. Additionally, it seems unlikely to me that someone would bother carving a warning into a tree when being actively slaughtered, and if they had managed to escape the slaughter and it was carved afterwards, why was the carver never found? There is some evidence to suggest that the more peaceful answer is the truth, happily. There's actually some archaeological evidence that implies that there was at the very least some close connections between the two groups, implying at the very least collaboration and trade, if not outright merging of the groups, and indeed, it is said that the colonists moved to be with, or at least interacted with, the Hatteras tribe. One particularly batshit theory is that because a map owned by John White had an X symbol, which may have represented a fort or settlement, covered by a patch, a common practice at the time as making maps could be extremely difficult and time consuming, but could be revealed when held up to the light, this X represents an alien mothership and the colonists were actually taken by aliens, because, of course. There's been extensive DNA analysis of the current inhabitants of the area, however, sadly, it is very difficult, though not impossible, to get reliable DNA from 400-year-old bones in areas it's believed the colonists may have moved to within Croatoan. return, which we cannot even confirm are legitimately from any of the colonists because, well, they disappeared. So progress in this area has been slow and there's been no conclusive evidence either way. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence, including that which we have already discussed, as well as things like the odd English name appearing among local populations, both oral and written histories, making claims such as explorer John Lawson in 1701, telling of how when he visited the region he heard some Hatteras Indians claiming their ancestors had been white people, and assumed based on this that the lost colonists had conformed themselves to the manner of their Indian relations, but again, this is far from conclusive proof. I'm reluctant to say that this mystery will never be solved because there's always a chance. I mean, they found out who the Somerton man was recently, so who knows, but as it stands right now, it seems unlikely that any definitive answers to the mystery of the colonist disappearance will come to light anytime soon. However, it is clear that this was very unlikely due to the National Park Service, which wouldn't exist for another 300 years. Is it missing 411? Well, it certainly does at least arguably fall within some of the parameters laid out at the beginning, but as you're probably starting to realise, so does just about every mysterious disappearance or death in some manner. This one's just really sad. In 2014, 2 Dutch women went on a 5 to 6 hour hike in the supposedly cursed mountains of Panama and disappeared, only to show up again, dead, months later in mysterious circumstances. Local authorities claimed it was a tragic accident. These 2 women were just unfamiliar with the region and succumbed to the elements or else became injured and were unable to contact help, etc. However, Dutch private investigators hired by the family were convinced that there was likely to be foul play involved and poked a good few holes in the authorities' theory that the 2 women had fallen off a cable bridge across the river and were simply washed away. What happened to the hikers is the subject of a lot of speculation, having gone viral online due to the seemingly mysterious final photos on the camera, which is theorized that they may have been using to light the way with the flash. One confusing element was that the backpack of one of them was found in a rice paddy on the bank of a local river around 10 miles from the town they left from and 5 miles from the summit of the hiking trail they were following, estimated to be around an 8-hour walk from their last known location, and in a very remote area which would have been difficult to reach on foot, especially as one of the hikers was asthmatic. Regarding the camera, it tells a strange story of the last moments of 2 human beings. Tragic, if not necessarily supernatural. The first pictures were of course standard tourist shots with both women laughing and smiling on a bright sunny day, with some selfies taken at particularly natural beautiful places along the trail. Then there are some photos showing them following an indigenous trail near a creek or stream bed, heading downhill away from their original destination. It's speculated that one of the hikers' faces in one of the shots shows anxiety, possibly due to the worry about getting lost in the jungle, or maybe, some speculate, because of something they've seen that is not captured on camera. Or maybe it was just a bad or unflattering picture. That happens sometimes. Image 508 is the last tourist photo taken by the 2 missing women. There are other photos that seem to have no purpose, such as a photo of one of their heads from the back, random photos of the floor and so on, which, as mentioned earlier, is possible was an attempt to use the camera's flash to illuminate the trail. It's here where things get a bit weird. There are 2 versions of photo 508 with different metadata, one that says it was taken 8 seconds after photo 507, but another version of the same photo was apparently taken 50 seconds before the previous photo. Now this anomaly could just be a glitch obviously, but some have speculated that it could be deliberate photo manipulation by someone. No more daytime photos were taken after this. And there's photo 509, which was deleted for some unexplained reason. Dutch IT specialists have tried to undelete it, which is usually fairly straightforward because, as many a sex offender has discovered, pressing the delete button does not necessarily mean the whole file is erased. However, experts failed to recover photo 509, and as it would be unlikely for the camera to skip a number by accident when shooting pictures, it is possible that someone connected the camera to a computer and erased the photo that way in order to make it irretrievable and then dump the camera. Some have claimed that it's plausible that the Panamanian authorities took photo 509 off the camera before releasing it to anyone else because something was on it that they didn't want the outside world to see, like Bigfoot perhaps, or I don't know, what cryptids does Panama have? Sisamito. Or maybe it in some way disproved the bridge accident theory scenario that the Panamanian police stubbornly stuck to, because they're in on it. Some people have since attributed the disappearances to local legends of cryptids like the Boachu, which is apparently like a kind of dragon with the head of a jaguar, or other kinds of local spiritual beliefs, like that they somehow somehow run across some angry or vengeful spirits which had led to their tragic fates. So was this a case of missing 411? It actually has a lot in common with similar missing 411 cases actually documented by David Paulides and claimed as fact by conspiracy YouTubers. So personally, if I was to categorize stuff like this, I would say that it absolutely counts, but well, it's not in the US, it's in Panama, so how could it possibly be connected to, for example, Kenny Beach and the M Cave? It's not like the US National Park Service has authority over some jungle in Panama, so how are they covering this up? Oh, no, never mind, it turns out missing 411 isn't even only in the US now, because Paulides has literally written a book called Missing 411 North America and Beyond, which expands the scope to include Australia, England, France, Iceland and Indonesia, as well as a few other examples of him using examples from Canada, though that one makes more sense because, you know, it is connected. This is basically the Texas Dogman Triangle, but at sea. Okay, sorry, I couldn't resist. You know what the Bermuda Triangle is. It's a section of the Atlantic Ocean off North America in which a lot of boats, ships, planes, etc. have gone missing in mysterious circumstances. The exact boundaries of the triangle, unlike more serious triangular areas such as the Texas Dogman Triangle, are not exact, but generally it's agreed that it covers approximately from the Atlantic coast of Florida to Bermuda to the islands known as the Greater Antilles, an area covering at least 500,000 if not 1.5 million square miles. Legends of the Triangle began with reports of unexplained occurrences in the region in the mid-19th century. A trend began to be noticed. Some ships washed up abandoned for no apparent reason. Others simply disappeared but transmitted no distress signals, implying that no crash had taken place. Aircraft have vanished as have rescue missions sent out to, well, rescue those disappeared ships and planes. Wreckage is rarely ever found, and obviously this leads to some rather interesting theories, mostly surrounding aliens. Though the supernatural is often blamed, it is obviously significantly more likely that natural and environmental factors are responsible. One hypothesis, and this is entirely taken from one of the sources in the description by the way, because I know fuck all about planes, is that pilots failed to account for the Agonic Line, a place at which there is no need to compensate for magnetic compass variation as they approach the Bermuda Triangle, resulting in significant navigational error and catastrophe. Or in other words, Earth's magnetic field is how navigation mostly works, or at least it was before GPS, and it's possible that this area has some kind of natural magnetic anomaly that causes navigational instruments to go to shit, causing ship captains to abandon ship and pilots to lose their way and crash in the ocean. Another popular theory is rogue waves, which are massive waves that can reach heights of up to 30.5 meters or 100 feet and would theoretically be powerful enough to destroy all evidence of a ship or aeroplane. The Bermuda Triangle is located in an area of the Atlantic Ocean where storms from multiple directions can converge, making rogue waves more likely to occur. You may recognise these from Assassin's Creed 4, where they were annoying as fuck to deal with whilst in naval combat. However, as with many of these things, it turns out that the legend of the Bermuda Triangle is likely just bullshit. According to the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, there is no evidence that mysterious disappearances occur with any greater frequency in the Bermuda Triangle than in any other large, well-travelled area of the ocean. And inconveniently for fans of the conspiracy theory, ships and planes continue to pass through the triangle without any issue every day. Now obviously this isn't missing 411, right? Well, why not? These are seasoned pilots and sailors going missing. The area covered by the triangle is fairly well travelled and safe. There is rarely if ever evidence of a struggle or foul play, and many of the victims of the triangle are found miles from their last known location, often in areas that are difficult to access. That's several criteria right there. Maybe it was sea Bigfoot. Supernatural disappearances are not really a new or unheard of phenomena, or perhaps that should be suspected supernatural disappearances or stories about supernatural disappearances because, well, there's no real evidence that the supernatural exists at all. However, what definitely does exist is a pattern of unexplained things happening and then humans filling the gaps in understanding with explanations they consider plausible. Regardless, this is a common trope in most folklore and superstition. It's very simple and effective really. Someone just kind kind of steps off the face of the earth, never to be seen or heard from again. Are they alive? Where did they go? How could someone just disappear like that? Rather predictably, this phenomenon has become a lot less common in our modern world due to our surveillance state, making it difficult to hide or disappear unless you truly go off-grid or go outside the reach of that technology, like for example in a massive national park. This is also of course why serial killing seemed to have peaked in the 60s and 70s. The invention of DNA forensics and CCTV make getting away with these crimes significantly more difficult. It's no longer the 60s where all you needed to do to get away with heinous crimes is just to be mildly careful about not being seen in the area, so most potential serial killers get caught way before they get really polished and competent at avoiding detection, unless the police are truly incompetent, which is definitely a possibility and is the main reason the modern serial killers we do know of manage to slip through the cracks. Anyway, back on topic, this also means that it is hardly surprising that modern disappearances happen in the few places where these modern tools, whether or not you like them, I definitely have complicated and negative feelings about the surveillance state, have no reach, or at least less of one. I personally genuinely believe that all so-called supernatural disappearances and deaths have a rational explanation, just one that we are simply not aware of right now. But for many people, the lack of a definitive explanation means that there must be a supernatural one. It's classic monster of the gap stuff, which we talked about more extensively in the cryptids video. Regardless, it is undeniable that there is a lot of morbid curiosity and fascination with the unknown that compels us to speculate on this stuff. I criticize believers in the supernatural and true crime content and so on, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't consume any of it, even though I don't believe many of the mysteries are all that mysterious. I've so far not watched the 7-hour Columbine Iceberg Explained though, because the fact that someone made that is just an indication that this shit has gone too fucking far. That's unhinged. I asked Bard, Google's version of ChatGPT, or at least it was called that when I originally wrote this video, but I believe it has since changed its name, for its opinion on this, and its answer was as follows. We talk about these disappearances, not to solve them, but to keep the questions alive, to remind ourselves that there are edges to our understanding, cracks in the facade of normalcy, and perhaps, just perhaps, in the whispers of the wind, in the flickering flames, we might catch a glimpse of something beyond, a hint of the secrets that the darkness holds. Which is very well said. Whoever originally said that Bard stole it from was onto something there. Anyway, let's talk examples. Legio IX Hispania, or the Ninth Spanish Legion, was a small portion of the Imperial Roman army stationed in Britain during the occupation, though for its almost 100 years' existence it was stationed all over the Roman Empire at one time or another. However, the interesting part about the Legio IX Hispania, and the reason we're talking about it today, is of course that around the year 120 CE it disappeared and never again appears in records with no explanation. Obviously, as a result, the mystery around the unknown fate of the Legion has caused a lot of people to embark on some quite considerable research, and of course speculation is rife, with on the one end of the realistic scale the theory that the Legion was part of a push into Caledonia, modern day Scotland, and were wiped out by the native Celts, who were known for much of ancient history as brutal, effective warriors. Much as people like to claim that the Romans were the ultimate fighting force of history, and generally they were never quite able to conquer Scotland, and indeed Scotland was only fully and mostly peacefully integrated into what would once become the UK in 1707, and all the way over the other end of the scale you have shit like aliens and some rip in space-time that they walk through and they'll be back again sometime, kind of like King Arthur I suppose. Indeed, local legends do tell of the ghosts of the Lost Legion marching through the countryside, so make of that what you will. So, is the missing 9th Roman Legion missing 411? It is in the UK, but that doesn't necessarily discount it, as we've already discussed, so something to consider. The Mary Celeste was a merchant ship that was discovered adrift and deserted in the Atlantic Ocean in 1872. It caused a stir at the time because of the rather eerie state in which it was found. The ship was found a little the worse for wear, but still seaworthy, with the lifeboat missing. The last entry into her log was dated 10 years earlier, with no explanation having been written in. The classic thing everyone remembers from this mystery, though, is the cargo and all the crew and belongings were undisturbed, down to half-eaten meals left on tables, giving the impression that the entire crew was there one moment and simply gone the next with no explanation. An investigation was carried out at the time, at which various possibilities were considered, mostly foul play, including mutiny by the crew, which wouldn't really explain why the crew then abandoned the ship they'd just taken, piracy, either by way of the ship that found the Celeste or another party, though that wouldn't explain why the cargo was left intact, and why there was no sign of a struggle, and conspiracy to carry out insurance or salvage fraud. Ultimately though, no conclusive evidence came to light, and the mystery has to this day remained unsolved. Nowadays it's one of the main examples people use to argue for UFO abductions. After all, what else could explain it? It would have to be something extremely urgent that seemingly caused the entire crew to abandon ship all at once, if it wasn't something natural. Some of the more realistic theories include the inebriative effects on the crew of alcohol fumes rising from the cargo, and the potentially connected theory that some of these fumes ignited or caused a minor explosion, causing everyone on board to panic and abandon ship for fear of fire, which on board a wooden ship is never fun. Other theories also gained popularity, like the submarine earthquakes, water spouts, attack by a giant squid, or the Kraken of legend, and of course a lot of paranormal stuff, including the Flying Dutchman, an infamous ghost ship said to take the souls of the damned or sea serpents. This wasn't missing 411, right? Well, as with the Bermuda Triangle, it does surprisingly tick a good few of the boxes, so I don't really feel comfortable saying no with 100% certainty. Water Bigfoot strikes again. Of course, the OGs of supernatural disappearances or abductions are our old friends the Fae, or old Celtic fairies, who, unlike our modern versions of them, are just brutal and terrifying nightmare creatures who delight in the torment of humans, including, of course, taking their children. There are various reasons given for the fairies' motive for stealing human children. Some tales imply that the stolen children are to be used as servants or slaves, or are kept in the manner of pets for the amusement of their fairy masters, in a kind of supernatural echo of our own history with the transatlantic slave trade. Others suggest a possibly darker purpose, that the fairies must pay a tithe of blood to the devil every 7 years and prefer to pay with the blood of others than their own. And the final version of the kidnap motive is a form of procreation, or to put it another way, fairies cannot breed, so must steal children and transform them in some way into a fairy. Or in some cases, they first sleep with a human woman and then steal the half-breed child to be transformed into one of them. This is the version of the lore that is shown in Torchwood, which somehow manages to make the Fae into some weird alien thing, and of course makes it edgy as possible for very little reason. So why have I brought this up? Well, I just find it fascinating that this is an ancient explanation for disappearances and shares a lot of similarities with the technically not Bigfoot but definitely Bigfoot missing 411 explanation. And surely it's just as plausible, right? Who's to say that these people being abducted in national forests are not being taken to the land of the fairies?
Hello, monkey!
This fucking guy. So let's talk about David Paulides, shall we? Short bio before we get into his works. He was a police officer from 1977 to 1996, working in SWAT as a court liaison officer, as a detective, and a number of other roles within law enforcement before getting fired after being charged with a misdemeanor count of falsely soliciting for a charity. Doing a Girard, as it's known nowadays. That joke was topical when I wrote it, probably less so now. After being fired from the police, rather than moving states and becoming a police officer elsewhere, as we know you can just do, instead Paulides decided to pursue his real passion, that being Bigfoot. In fact, Paulides has written 2 entire books about Bigfoot. First, Hooper Project of Bigfoot Encounters in 2008 and Tribal Bigfoot in 2009. Or at least officially he's only written 2. I would argue that he's written 12, taking the 10 missing 411 books into account, because being a Bigfoot fan, he's consistently heavily implied that Bigfoot is involved in the phenomenon, though officially what he does in Missing 411 is nothing more than investigating and documenting various disappearances that he claims fall under the umbrella of Missing 411, and that's not even including his documentaries, which, unlike the simple and legit sounding Missing 411 books, which are called things like The Devil's in the Details and A Sobering Coincidence, along with just place names or categories like Montana and Law, I named Missing 411 2017, Missing 411 The Hunted 2019, and then of course the classic Missing 411 The UFO Connection in 2022. Incredible stuff. This is is my kind of trash. I love UFO documentaries, and Ancient Aliens is my biggest guilty pleasure. Oh, and also, Paulides founded his own Bigfoot club called the North American Bigfoot Search, or NABS, so, he's definitely a very serious person. Speaking of being a serious person, Paulides has said that North American Bigfoot Search was instrumental in providing an apparently academic paper published in 2013, which claimed that Bigfoot was real. The world needs to understand that North America Bigfoot Search was the organizer of the study. We orchestrated the search that led to picking Melba S. Ketchum to conduct a study of Bigfoot DNA. Basically, what this paper did was document the analysis of 111 samples of supposed Bigfoot DNA, claiming that the study confirmed the existence of a hybrid cross between modern humans and an unknown primate. Or in other words, Bigfoot exists and he's a human-gorilla hybrid or something. It was, however, basically full of shit, because of course it was, and was torn to shreds by skeptics who actually knew what they were talking about pretty much immediately. For example, Scientist magazine analysed the paper and reported that the data failed to support claims of the existence of a new species of ape or ape man, but rather analyses either come back as 100% human or fail in ways that suggest technical artifacts. The website for the publisher, the De Novo Journals of Science, was set up the same year as the paper's release, and there is no indication that NABS's work, the only study it has published, was ever peer-reviewed. According to Paulides, his work on Missing 411 began when he was doing non-specific research, presumably into Bigfoot, in a national park, and an off-duty park ranger, having been aware of Paulides' reputation, asked him to look into missing people in national parks. Now, obviously, this is total bullshit. Everything about it, from the coincidental meeting to the park ranger knowing some random Bigfoot enthusiast was the best guy to enlist to help investigate serious criminal cases, and just the way it seems perfectly designed to stroke Paulides' ego, when, in my opinion, it's significantly more likely that Paulides, being a Bigfoot guy, decided to subtly build a case for Bigfoot existing and being covered up by the US government in a way he could plausibly deny that that's what he was doing. However, whatever the case may be, Paulides claims that he uncovered evidence suggesting negligence on the part of the National Park Service in failing to locate the missing people, which is a fine observation, obviously, probably even true. I mean, the US government often has massive issues with its three-letter agencies, and it's probably true that more could be done to help locate missing people. The issue is that, in my opinion, this is more likely to be incompetence or lack of priority than malice or deliberate cover-up. Paulides has since broadened the scope of his investigation to include missing people from across the world, which kind of makes the focus on the NPS a bit weird, and this has ultimately led to a belief that he has uncovered a mysterious, or perhaps even sinister, series of worldwide disappearances, which he says defy logical and conventional explanations. I don't know, maybe this was just a series of natural, if tragic accidents, unfortunate incidents or complications from the very beginning, and is likely to crop up naturally everywhere in the world that has similar circumstances, like people getting lost in nature, falling down an unseen slope, or even being victims of animal attacks or suffering fatal health problems, are a universal set of possible explanations, and as a result would need to be global. If anything, expanding Missing 411 beyond the US kind of takes away from its credibility, because if you can prove it's isolated to one country and the responsibility for documenting and investigating a phenomenon falls upon a single government agency, I mean, it's still bullshit, but I admit that it's compelling in a way. But like most massive conspiracies, it kind of falls apart when you start to consider the amount of global agencies and organizations that would all need to be in on the conspiracy for decades without anyone learning about it or even considering it until 2013. It's kind of like flat Earth in that way. Like, in order to believe that the Earth is flat, one would also have to believe that just about every major public agency, and a number of private ones too, like for example most scientists, universities, airline companies, etc., would have to be in on this massive conspiracy to perpetuate this idea of a globe Earth, and that's simply not plausible. It would be impossible to maintain such a lie. The one saving grace though is, as mentioned, Paulides deliberately avoids naming a potential solution or explanation, opting instead to simply hint and leave any speculating about supernatural causes up to the imaginations of the audience. Or at least it did until 2022, when he just made a documentary called The UFO Connection. The closest he usually gets is saying vague stuff like, the field of suspects is narrowing, and suggesting readers look outside their normal comfort zone to determine who or what is causing the phenomenon, because it's Bigfoot, or sometimes aliens now I guess. But if he just said that, people would just laugh at him, so he keeps it just vague enough to escape ridicule most of the time.
I met with a physicist named John Brandenburg. Now, John is a contract physicist for NASA and a brilliant man. And we ended up sitting there, and we ended up using maybe 10 minutes of the interview, but we talked for 4 or 5 hours. And John said, Dave, portals, multiple dimensions, they're all true. And he says, we as a group of physicists, there's 8 of us around the world that get around and talk about this all the time. And mainstream media doesn't want to talk about it and doesn't want to give it its valid points. But Dave, it's been happening probably for eons. How it happens, when it happens, why it happens, we're trying to understand. And he says, but you got to also understand that there's some way that these portals are armed, meaning there's some intellect, intelligence behind the portal. And he says, so we would like to understand how we could use that portal to, say, point it at a tank in a field and just to take the tank right out of the field. And he said, in your research, Dave, where you have a small child standing in a national park right next to their parents, and this is 100% true, the parents turn their back for 30 seconds. They turn back around, the child's gone. They search, they yell, they scream. How far can a 2-year-old go in 20, 30 seconds? They look all around, the kid's gone. They bring canines to the scene, they can't pick up a scent. Well, now how did that child get out of there so quick? Now bring on John D'Souza. John says, Dave, portals, multi-dimensions, they're all true.
Alright, just before we end, let's watch some unhinged documentaries, shall we? And by we, I do mean me, because you have to pay to see them, and I'm going to avoid showing as much of them here as possible, because whilst I'm pretty much expecting this video to get either demonetized or copyright claimed, because all my longer videos do pretty much, I especially don't want to give any money to David Paulides. I also have the original Missing 411 book, but there's so many of them that whilst I might see if I can access some of the more recent ones, I'm not going to really get into them here. If relevant, I may reference them, but they're all pretty much the same to an extent. They exist to build up evidence and support the overall conspiracy theory, but ultimately bring no new ideas to the table, as we've mentioned a few times already, Paulides is careful not to give an actual explanation for the phenomenon he's supposedly reporting on. I'm obviously not going to read all these fuckers, but I have read a few to provide a decent idea of the overall vibe of them. Incidentally, by the way, whilst trying to find a free PDF copy of these books, I found an old Reddit post that links to Paulides' aforementioned Bigfoot website, which is the cheapest place to find the books legitimately, and rather than having an author website or anything, his main online presence appears to be on his website, which, as previously mentioned, is a site called North American Bigfoot Search, and looks like this. Incredible stuff. Anyway, as it turns out, most of the books are boring, if important and necessary, coverage of these disappearance cases. There are hints and suggestions of something more in the introductory chapters, much of it just criticism of the NPS for their lack of comprehensive tracking of data regarding disappearances in national parks, and there's the occasional line about a disappearance not making sense, or just the classic just asking questions stuff, like where in one case he goes off on one based on one eyewitness statement. The case of the woman in France who describes an invisible force taking her is the first time someone has come forward to describe the abduction in detail. Could this description of the event give us insight into what may be occurring in many of these incidents? Could this event shed light on some type of force taking people that we don't understand and are unwilling to study? Many of the missing are unaccounted for during the initial 12 to 24 hours, and then they're sometimes found. What is happening to them during this initial disappearance time that has searchers, canines, and relatives baffled? And so on, you get the point. It's subtle and constant throughout, outside of the introductory chapters where it's spelled out more clearly. This is repeated throughout all of the books, so there's not really that much to say, to be honest. When I first started this video, I thought most of it would be about the books, but there's actually not too much to say. Paulides may be the originator of Missing 411, but the books lack the outright unhinged conspiracy nonsense that other people, including, as we will see, Paulides himself in the documentaries, go on to extrapolate from the information presented through his research. It's more implication than anything. In my opinion, Paulides is a sort of Mark Sargent figure. He popularised and originated a lot of these ideas, but the work that made him so popular and influential is by far no longer the most engaging or convincing voice pushing these same ideas. But sadly, I'm afraid to say these books are just kind of shit, but lack the balls to be honest about what the author actually believes, despite being sold on a website called fucking North American Bigfoot Search. Disappointing, but this is not a book review, and it's the idea that we're concerned with, not the delivery. So let's move on to the documentaries, which, as this is a visual medium, should be more entertaining for you. These are probably a lot more useful in understanding the ideas than the books. By design and by necessity of the medium, it is streamlined and stripped down to the most basic and understandable ideas. As in a documentary, it has significantly less time and space to explore ideas than an entire book. Just a bit of inside baseball here, these long videos translate to around 15 to 20,000 words for each 90 to 120 minute video. This one in particular is around 17,000 words. And I speak quite quickly, and the majority of the time is taken up just with me talking. So a proper TV documentary, that's probably more words than you'd need to fill the same time. For comparison, according to most sources I was able to find online, 50 to 100,000 words is pretty normal for your average book. In other words, if you turned a non-fiction book into a video script, the resulting video essay would be approximately 5 hours long at the low end and 10 hours at the upper end, even if we use my particularly fast talking speed and assume that literally 100% of the runtime is verbally imparting information. There's a reason why movie adaptations of books are usually at most 2 to 3 hours long, whereas your average audiobook usually ends up being tens of hours long. So this should be a little easier to cover. Alright, so I've just watched as many of these documentaries, at least the ones that Paulides himself was directly involved in, as I can, and I must say that originally they start off fairly normal true crime documentary style. Take a look at the first one specifically from 2016. It's just documenting the stories of disappeared people with interviews with witnesses and family members, that sort of thing. Pretty standard true crime TV movie. There's little to no real speculation or hinting at anything supernatural, though there is some discussion of similarities which we're aware of by now. It's the main source of evidence for this stuff being supernatural. It's quite a well-made documentary really, surprisingly low energy for an American documentary, though that may just be me being more used to conspiracy shows like Ancient Aliens, which is by comparison absolutely breakneck in its pace. I actually really respect Paulides for not sensationalizing his investigations into deaths and disappearances as much as he could. The same can't be said for his fans, especially online. The same really can't be said for Missing 411 The Alien Connection, which just acknowledges that fuck it, this is a conspiracy and conspiracy people love alien bullshit. It's a real jumping the shark moment, or maybe a mask slip if you want to be cynical about it. It follows a similar format to the original in that it goes over a number of cases of missing people and weird things happening, except here instead of oh this guy just disappeared, it's by the way there's aliens and sometimes they take people. There's a lot of focus on this hiker was so careful and experienced, he could never succumb to the elements arguments, and like, I don't know man, I know a lot of good drivers who would never think he could get into a crash, but it still happens. Shit happens. Even if you're very good and very careful, there's always an element of danger in life in general, and especially if you're doing something like exploring the wilderness. Oh, and also the police are covering up aliens abducting moose, apparently.
You brought up the elk case that you investigated in Washington.
I was actually at a conference when the call came in. He told a story about 14 or 15 people, I think it was, who were out planting trees on a hillside on a big piece of property owned by a commercial logging company. They had seen an object approach from the east, and they stood there and watched it for a few seconds. He called the object to the attention of the workers, and they all looked up and saw it as well. And it flew towards a herd of elk that these guys had been watching all morning long as they worked on a hillside. All the elk bolted to the northeast to heavy cover, except for one hapless elk. And the object lifted the elk off the ground, and it started moving slowly in the direction in which that herd of elk had gone.
It's less of a true crime documentary, more of an alien one. It's less frantic and energetic than Ancient Aliens, but it uses many of the same tactics as UFO guys or even ghost hunters. The word coincides is literally one of Paulides' favourites. He loves pretending like coincidence is some kind of proof, hearsay and unreliable witnesses, with a good healthy dose of the government is covering it all up, with help from Paulides' own personal friend, who is a leading UFO investigator.
I had a good friend in the state of Washington that is really a UFO expert, and I want to take it to him.
My name is Peter Davenport. For the last 26 years, I've been the director of the National UFO Reporting Center, and that's what I do. I'm a UFO investigator.
And reliance on and deliberate misrepresentation of indigenous folklore and local history, and also, obviously, shaky straight-up bullshit evidence, including but not limited to fucking hypnotherapy. Basic shit. Be more original, Mr. Paulides, I beg of you. I did enjoy the multiple long stories about elk getting abducted by alien spacecraft, to be honest. More of that, please, but less of bringing on alien conspiracy theorists like John D'Souza, who Google Books describes as such. John D'Souza unravels mysteries that elude investigators restricted to the purely material world. The author devotes himself to his companies and to writing books on spiritual and paranormal topics, and claiming that they're totally neutral private investigators who add credibility to your alien bullshit. That would be good.
When an investigation starts to push the limits of standard everyday police protocol, I start to look for professionals on the outside that could assist me. I'm someone who's not so stubborn as to admit what I don't know. And at this point, I looked for professional help in the name of retired FBI agent John D'Souza.
My name is John D'Souza. I was an FBI special agent for 25 years. I've worked all types of cases, counterterrorism, violent crimes, paranormal cases as well. And I'm pretty well known for that sort of thing.
Now, your background to me is interesting because you've worked a variety of criminal cases.
I worked the Unabomber case. I worked 1994 World Trade Center bombing.
The biggest case you ever worked?
It would have to be 9/11.
John, how many times have you testified in front of a U.S. court for a U.S. attorney?
Maybe like 100 times.
And how many times has the court decided that you're an expert in a certain area?
Probably every time I've testified.
I can't think of anybody who's in a position more to tell the truth and with great things to risk than you.
Alright, that's most of what I had to say on this, but before we get to the conclusion, let's briefly go over some of the less common but no less silly supernatural explanations for missing 411 that have a lot of people convinced somehow. I really want to make a video in the same vein as this one about aliens or UFOs someday, but until I get around to doing that, let's talk specifically about extraterrestrial theories and missing 411. Obviously, this is essentially exactly the same as the Bigfoot theory, but with a different supernatural creature, but with certain specific twists. Alien abduction would nicely explain disappearances, likewise with bodies being found with strange injuries or in an area that should be inaccessible to them. They were taken by the aliens to the mothership, experimented upon, and beamed back to Earth near-ish to where they were taken, but not exactly, because why would they care? And other weird anomalies like the M cave were actually alien artifacts or some shit. Obviously, aliens would be smart enough and in possession of sufficiently advanced technology to be able to do this without raising suspicion, and presumably target national parks specifically because they're so remote and people going missing can plausibly be considered to have just succumbed to the elements. See, it's intentional that this could all be rationally explained. That's what the aliens want you to think. And you sheep will believe it because you've been brainwashed by the moon's telepathic confusion beams into not seeing lizard people among us. It's a conspiracy that goes right to the very top. The US government does some truly fucked up stuff, from MKUltra to enacting coups and overthrowing democratically elected governments in the third world to, well, just about everything the CIA has been responsible for decades. There is absolutely an AI-generated iceberg out there on this if you want to learn more, or I guess you can read a book if you're a fucking nerd. Anyway, there's two main versions of this story. First, there's the more sinister one that these disappearances are as a direct result of the government, like they're a result of some kind of clandestine CIA or NPS operation, kidnapping, abducting, and maybe even killing or experimenting upon lost hikers, and that's why missing 411 is a thing. Or maybe it's some kind of experimental weapon or technology. That's what happened to Kenny Veach. He found the government's secret bunker and or super nuke. The other, less sinister but still kind of sinister version of this is of course the obvious but less interesting idea that there's something going on and the government is aware of it but is either unable or unwilling to stop it. This does include Bigfoot, but also includes UFOs and basically anything you can imagine the government might want to hide, which, I mean, sure, why not? If we're already going to some pretty wacky places, I mean, why not go full sci-fi? Seriously though, conspiracy people love the idea of dimensional rifts, especially to explain away mysterious or unexplained shit. It's often how ancient aliens people justify their bullshit, and missing 411 is no different. Obviously, these people accidentally stumbled into a rip in space-time and either found themselves in the past, or maybe they found one, explored for a bit, and then came back through it, or found another one. The idea being, if you fall through the rift and don't find your way back, that's you having just disappeared, but if you fall through one and manage to return, maybe it moved or time moves differently, so the victim falls in, spends a day or so in the world beyond, either dies or is trapped there, or alternately finds their way back but dies in the process, thus explaining how they moved implausible distances or have unexplained injuries. Maybe they got attacked by a dinosaur or killed and sent back through the portal by aliens. Likewise, this theory posits, maybe that's where Bigfoot comes from. Maybe he's from the other side of the portal and fell through into our world, just like missing 411 people did in the other direction. Maybe there's a planet out there that's speculating on the world being a location of disappeared ape men who disappeared whilst hiking. Or maybe this is a rip in reality and leads to an alternate dimension or mirror universe where ancient apes evolved into Bigfoots instead of humans, and those theories about Bigfoot being an ancient human ancestor offshoot are kind of correct. And if this theory is true, maybe it's actually that the government is covering it up. A real version of Torchwood, basically, but it's a forest in the US rather than Cardiff, which makes it infinitely worse in my opinion. Why have I mentioned Torchwood twice in this video? Honestly, after spending so much time researching this, I feel like I need to start making a tinfoil hat so my brain is protected from all this conspiracy bullshit. The thing about most conspiracies is that they need to be either really easily hidden or small scale. For example, the Jeffrey Epstein thing, which is an actual conspiracy that actually happened, most of the crimes took place away from the eyes of the public and police, involved a lot of powerful people who all had a vested interest in remaining silent, and there were very few loose ends, and still eventually got exposed. Indeed, whilst it was downplayed originally, Epstein was arrested for similar crimes years earlier. At the other end of the spectrum, as I mentioned earlier, look at Flat Earth. In order for Flat Earth to be real, so many people have to be in on the conspiracy that it becomes kind of unrealistic, as it would become impossible to maintain for any period of time. The same can be said of UFOs and aliens, with a completely separate cryptid having to be invented in order to explain away the rather obvious fact that if aliens had visited us, we should know about it, in the form of the Men in Black, a supposedly supernatural, possibly governmental organisation tasked with covering up evidence of alien encounters. Missing 411 falls somewhere in the middle, in my opinion. It's in public and in the open and obviously isn't restricted to a highly controlled and hidden area, and requires a significant but not unimaginable number of people in on the conspiracy. The main question, which is the same we must ask of any conspiracy theory, is quite simply, well, why? Like, why bother cover it up? The above mentioned real conspiracy of Epstein's billionaire nonce ring makes sense to be kept hidden because the people involved have so much to lose if found out, and they obviously got a sexual thrill out of their activities, but who stands to gain anything by covering up the Flat Earth or Bigfoot or aliens? Why wouldn't some former Area 51 agent, Man in Black or National Park Service Bigfoot wrangler at least come forward with some kind of evidence? Especially in the age of social media and all of our other modern technologies like drones, satellite imaging, etc., you can bet that kind of shit wouldn't stay hidden forever. Do I believe in missing 411? No, I don't. I think that's pretty clear. But much like all the Ancient Aliens episodes I've watched, I do find it entertaining and fun to think about. But ultimately, it's just too implausible. Too many points of potential failure, and nobody credible has ever slipped up or spoken out for fame or money or whatever. Sorry, I'm not buying it. It's like that old joke people tell. Maybe the aliens or Bigfoot or whatever are deliberately choosing to appear exclusively to unhinged weirdos who no one will believe anyway. The checklist or list of what counts as a legitimate missing 411 case is pretty arbitrary and just so happens to overlap significantly with things that might be present if one were to succumb to the elements. Bigfoot isn't real. I don't think I need to elaborate on that really. He's real in our hearts perhaps, but not in, reality. People go missing all the time, sometimes in mysterious circumstances, sometimes in weird and mysterious places, and so on. But this does not mean that they have been taken or that there's some kind of supernatural reasoning behind it, or even that a mystery is anything more than just something that you don't have all the information about. A lack of knowledge does not necessarily mean that you can start blaming shit on God or ghosts or cryptids or witches or the Fae or Bigfoot. Please start actually living in the same reality as the rest of us, I beg of you. The government is dodgy and organisations like the FBI and CIA are obviously capable of some really bad, underhand and secretive shit, but again, it comes down to incentives. The CIA had reasons for example, destabilising much of South America, torturing terror suspects, and even, to throw a bone to the conspiracy theorists, killing JFK. But what exactly would be the benefit of hiding Bigfoot or covering up a serial killer in national parks, and why would the National Park Service be doing underhand things like this? What do they, or the US government, stand to gain? I would argue very little. little. Nobody is hiding or covering up Bigfoot or the Wendigo or anything like that. I'm sorry to say. I would like to live in that world, but we do not live in that world.